Thank you, Andrea, and hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back in Brussels for this meeting. So I'm Stephen Williams. I'm a cardiologist from the University of Edinburgh and also from King's College in London, and I'm going to speak about our platform for data analysis. But I wanted to start with a statement, actually, and my statement is this, that in my view, clinical cardiology in general and electrophysiology in particular are beginning to lag other fields in the adoption of digital approaches to guide therapy. Now, speaking at a combined cardiology and engineering conference, this might seem like somewhat of a provocative statement, but I think there are some data to suggest that we can think about ways to do better. So these are data from PubMed showing the well-documented explosion in artificial intelligence research over the last decade. And in actual fact, this slide, as you'll see now, is a couple of years old. The number of publications has actually doubled between 2022 and now. So if we remade this slide, this would now be around 300,000 publications. But one of the striking things for me in these data are the relatively small proportion of studies which pertain to cardiology and in particular to electrophysiology. So cardiology is accounting for less than 2% of the available publications and electrophysiology for less than 0.25%. And if we dive into the types of studies which are being published, then for me, it's really the specialties which are really good at organizing their data. So things like oncology, radiology, and the laboratory-based specialties, which are really leading the way. Cardiology, you'll see, is in the middle of the pack, and poor old electrophysiology is right down at the bottom. But of course, the scientific studies only really perhaps tell half the story. And of course, for me as a clinician, what's important at the end of the day is translation into clinical practice. Now, we don't have very much data from the UK, but for the US, the FDA helpfully maintained this list of artificial intelligence-enabled medical devices that have received device registration. It's available from this website. And this list currently runs to just over 1,200 publications, and helpfully they're categorized into their primary medical specialty. And these data tell a slightly different story. So this time it's radiology that is really by far and away leading the way. But cardiovascular is in second place with around 10% of the available publications. And if we look into the types of data that these publications are using, the story is perhaps, for me as an electrophysiologist and as a biomedical engineer, slightly more on the, let's say, disappointing side. So the studies that are leading the way, the devices that are leading the way are things like early warning scores for patient deterioration, remote monitoring for patient deterioration, things like fluid balance assessment tools. ECG is, of course, up there in second place. But what about electrophysiology? Well, there really are only a few medical device registrations pertaining to intracardiac electrophysiology data, and so they're lumped in here with the others. So all of this, of course, led me to the question of why. And I would argue that it's not because of the richness of cardiovascular data. So this is a slide that I sometimes use to give an overview of our own group's research across imaging, modeling, and electrophysiology domains, applied in clinical research and in animal research contexts. Other groups, of course, make use of legions of data in cardiovascular, sometimes ECG data sets that might run to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of patients. It's also not, of course, because of the importance of heart rhythm disorders. These are really important. I mean, I don't need to tell this audience how important these conditions are, but responsible for a significant burden of symptoms and a risk factor for major cardiovascular outcomes. And it's also not because of how common these conditions are. So by the turn of this century, atrial fibrillation, of course, is expected to, by the turn of the middle of this century, atrial fibrillation is expected to affect well over 60 million patients. And it's also not because of how good we are at treating them. So depending on the severity of the disease, our success rates for treating atrial fibrillation and other arrhythmias may be as low as 50%. So what then is the cause? And I think one good way of looking at this is to think about what radiology does really well. And for me, there are three things. So availability of data standards, availability of analytics tools, and availability of data sources. So in radiology, we of course have the DICOM imaging standard for the storage of data. We have well-developed radiology information systems for analyzing that data. And we have local, regional, and sometimes national archiving systems for archiving the data. And for the rest of this talk, what I'd like to focus on is how we've been trying to do work in each of these three areas to advance electrophysiology digital innovation. So the first piece of the puzzle is OpenEP. Now, OpenEP is our data format for storing electrophysiology data. And I'm not going to say too much about the data format itself. We discussed some of that last year at this conference, and there's a lot of information available on the website. But what I did want to highlight is just how prevalent these data are now. So of course, everyone in this room, I'm sure, knows how these data are collected using catheters in the heart to create these wonderful pictures of electrophysiology. But just look at that graph at the bottom. So well over, and this graph is actually just in the US, the UK, and the EU. Well over 500,000 of these studies are performed per year. This is without even considering the rest of the world, China, Australia, and so on and so forth. These data give really detailed information about tissue structure. They've been used to predict outcomes, and they've been used to guide therapies. But there's a problem with these data, and that's that these data are not stored in the medical record in a structured way. In fact, there is currently no standard way to store these data, so manufacturers come up with their own system definitions, their own data formats. They're not interoperable, and we cannot access these data in the future. I sort of say this phrase quite often now. For the past 5 years, I've really been banging this drum, but it is now 2025. We are a quarter of the way through this century, and this status quo still exists. It would be a bit like a patient coming, for a CT scan, the data being available while the patient is in the CT scanner. It's not archived in the medical record. You can't see it in 5 years' time when the patient returns with the same problem or with a new problem. And I really think this has to change. The other problem with the data is that it can run into really, really large data sets. So nowadays, with high resolution mapping, it's not uncommon for the exports for these systems to exceed 10 to 15 gigabytes in size. Now, partly this is because of the volume of data, but it's also partly because there hasn't been a great impetus to compress the data, going back to that problem, because we don't store it in the medical record. So that's really where OpenEP fits in, and it provides data parsers that's able to convert many of the electrophysiology and electroanatomic mapping data formats into a standard reference data format, and this is what we use for our own research. You see on the right-hand side of this slide, a slide about the size of the data, and OpenEP is extremely space efficient, so we're able to reduce the storage space requirements really by 2 orders of magnitude. So a data set that might be between 1 and 15 gigabytes from a clinical system is compressed to around perhaps 10 to maybe 150 megabytes. Very similar in size to the storage space requirements, for example, for an MRI scan. So the second piece of the puzzle is EP Workbench. And EP Workbench is our graphical interface for handling and analyzing electrophysiology data on desktop computers. There are well-developed tools now in EP Workbench for visualization, for data cleaning, for extracting features from electrophysiological data. But this morning, what I thought I would focus on are 2 of the tools that we're very excited with, so the work in progress module and integration with high-performance computing. So the work in progress module is something which we developed to solve a problem where we are often asked to implement new types of analyses within EP Workbench. And of course, doing all of the software engineering that will allow those analyses to be implemented in a robust way with all of the quality control is actually quite a big engineering task. And so the work in progress module allows us a method to be agile. Of course, it's important to be agile to be able to implement new analysis techniques and to understand how they can be of clinical benefit. So the work in progress module allows us to do that. And it consists really of 3 things: an editor, a workspace, and a manager. And the editor is shown here. So the editor is a place where biomedical engineers and researchers can put their own Python code into EP Workbench. But the part in yellow is also really exciting. So that's a place where they can define how they would like the user interface to now appear. So if, for example, there are things that a particular algorithm needs to be configured at runtime, maybe some constants or some other parameters, the users can now put these into the editor for the work in progress module, and those options will appear within the interface. So to see this in action, perhaps the best way to do that is to look at a simple example. And so this is an example showing data actually from Luigi. And the example we're going to show here is how to calculate the gradient of a local activation time field. So shown on the map as a local activation time map. And each of the purple boxes is one of these work in progress modules. And the top one is the one we made for Luigi, showing how to calculate the gradient of an activation field. So these all appear within the manager. In the bottom part, we have the workspace, and just 2 things to highlight. You can see how the workspace has been configured on the fly to be able to have these options. Simple example, so there are just 2 options: the case that we want to process and the data field that we want to calculate the gradient for. When the user is ready, they press the little play button at the top, a progress bar appears. When processing completes, it turns green, and you can see now that the map has converted to show, it's thresholded here, but to show the gradient of that activation time field. So it's just an example to show, quite a simple example to show what's possible. But of course, now the great beauty of this system is that really the analyses that are now possible with these data are only really limited by your imagination and what is technically possible within the Python programming language. So the second part to highlight is the integration with EP Workbench and high-performance computing. So this is quite important for some of that work, Olaf, that you were showing. The data processing requirements are really high, and you need to be able to connect often to remote machines. And so EP Workbench now provides the ability to connect via SSH to remote computers. We will often use that in our own research, the work that Ali is doing, in order to conduct simulations of atrial fibrillation. And so this is a slide just showing some of the different tools that we have brought together within EP Workbench in order to conduct the atrial fibrillation simulations. And much like the work in progress module, when the simulations are complete, the simulation bar will turn green, but you can then retrieve the data into EP Workbench and you can see the analysis. And because of the work in progress module, we can now undertake complicated analysis of the results of the simulations all within this graphical platform. But the final piece of the puzzle is OpenEP Net. And so these tools are only of a certain amount of use, and actually that use is quite limited without access to the data. And so the OpenEP Net study is a study that we were very fortunate to have funded earlier this year with a large grant from the Medical Research Council in the UK. And it's going to allow us to do two key things. The first is to curate data using the OpenEP format, really from the length and the breadth of the United Kingdom. But the second is to move EP Workbench into the cloud so that researchers will be able to log into the remote system and have access to the data and the tools to analyze that data. We have some scientific hypotheses that we are testing through OpenEP Net, but really the main value and the reason the grant has been funded is because this is designed to provide a resource for the community. So other researchers in the future will be able to access the environment just as we can access the environment in Edinburgh. This slide is just to show some of the structure to the OpenEP Net platform. At the bottom, that's us. So those are researchers and also future sub-study researchers. The study sites contribute data into the trusted research environment. The research environment also, however, integrates with other data sources. So those are the parts shown on the right. And this is really important in the UK. So from these data sources, we can get things like, did the patient have a future arrhythmia? Did they die? What medications did they use? And so for the first time, really at a population level, we'll have a linkage between the arrhythmia electrophysiology data through the research platform and these important cardiovascular outcomes. So when we start to think about analyzing data on really a population level, this is now a different scale. So many electrophysiology studies will run to perhaps 100 to 200 patients, perhaps in Andrea's MASH studies to a few thousand patients. But in these studies, we're now thinking about perhaps tens, 20s, or even hundreds of thousands of patients. And so we have to start to think really carefully about how efficient we are at data processing. So in order to do some benchmarking, we've set up this quite simple protocol where we extract some features from electrophysiology data across several domains. So we've got geometric data, voltage data, conduction data, and electrogram data. And when we start to think about how long it takes to process these data, the system are really quite efficient. So you can see the bar at the bottom representing the overall time for analysis, and it's about 2 to maybe 10 seconds, depending on the amount of data that's present. We think we can do quite a lot better because you can see quite a lot of that data processing time is in the loading and the pre-processing of the data, but the actual extraction of the features is pretty quick. And so then on this slide, you can then see the cumulative time taken to process just a small data set of 100 patients, and we're pretty similar across Mac and Linux operating systems. But this is processing one case at a time in a single threaded manner. But of course, the beauty of having access to modern computing is that we can parallelize these problems. So we can send little bits of the data to different processors in order to analyze the data much more quickly. As for all multi-processing problems, this has a small cost. It takes slightly longer to process an individual case because you're distributing the problem. But you can see on the right-hand side, as we increase to 2, 4, 8, and beyond in terms of the number of processors, the overall processing time reduces. Now, the initial analytics nodes that we will have available through the OpenEP Net study will have around 4 processes. And so in order to undertake analysis of perhaps a couple of thousand of patient data sets extracting these types of figures, the processing time will be less than an hour. So we think this is now a tractable problem, for example, for PhD candidates to be undertaking research through the system. So then finally, by way of conclusion, I thought I would just put up my little Venn diagram again. And I think we've shown how the OpenEP ecosystem now provides, or will shortly provide, functionality across each of these key domains. So we have the OpenEP format as the availability of a data standard. We have the EP Workbench platform on desktop computers and shortly in the cloud for the availability of analytics tools. And we have the OpenEP Net Study, which will begin from around January of next year as the availability of data sources. And I'll be really happy to have conversations if people feel that they may be able to benefit from accessing the data, through the system, because that is exactly what it's for, and that's what drives the whole team, actually. And that team are shown here, so to acknowledge everyone's contribution to this work, which has been ongoing now for a number of years. So thank you again for the invitation, and I will finish there.